Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling stories the Ozark Highlands have ever whispered about, in hushed tones behind closed doors. In the remote hills, where communities depended on their own resources for survival, where the nearest doctor might be days away by rough trail, there lived a woman whose knowledge of birthing was unmatched and whose refusals were absolute. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we explore this mystery of selection and rejection. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The year 1849 marked a period of established but still isolated settlement in the Ozark Highlands of northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. The region had been officially opened to homesteading for several decades, and communities of varying sizes dotted the landscape, connected by trails that ranged from well-traveled routes to barely visible traces through dense forest. These communities were largely self-sufficient by necessity, developing their own systems of mutual aid and specialized skills that allowed them to survive without regular access to the goods and services available in more developed regions. Medical care was particularly limited, with trained physicians few and far between, their services expensive when available at all. Most communities relied instead on individuals who had developed practical knowledge through experience and informal apprenticeship: bone setter, herbalists, and most crucially, midwives. Birth was a community event in these settlements, an occasion that brought women together in support of the laboring mother, combining folk knowledge passed down through generations with practical experience and whatever medical understanding had filtered into the frontier from more educated sources. The midwife occupied a position of special importance and respect, her skills literally determining who lived and who died during the dangerous process of bringing new life into the world. A competent midwife could mean the difference between a thriving community and one decimated by maternal and infant mortality. Such women were valued, protected, and forgiven almost any eccentricity or peculiarity, so long as their essential service remained available. In the cluster of settlements scattered along a creek valley in what would eventually become northern Arkansas, the primary midwife was a woman named Judith Mercer. She was 47 years old in 1849, a widow who had come to the region 15 years earlier with her husband, a farmer who had died in an accident involving a falling tree during the brutal winter of 1842. Judith had no children of her own. A series of miscarriages and one stillbirth had ended her own hope of motherhood. But she had attended her first birth at age 17 back in Tennessee, assisting her own mother, who had been a midwife of considerable skill. Over the 30 years since, Judith had developed into a practitioner whose competence was recognized throughout the region, whose presence at a birth substantially improved the odds of a successful outcome. She was a tall woman, lean and strong despite her age. With gray hair she kept pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that people described as seeing more than they should. Her hands were her most remarkable feature, large and capable, with long fingers that could reach into difficult positions, manipulate a breech baby into correct presentation, or staunch bleeding with pressure applied at exactly the right location. She moved through her work with the confidence of someone who had seen every variation of normal and abnormal birth, who could assess a situation instantly and make decisions that others would agonize over. Judith lived alone in a cabin at the edge of one of the larger settlements, a community of perhaps 30 families known as Birch Creek for the distinctive trees that lined the main watercourse. Her cabin was larger than necessary for a single occupant, with a main room that served as both living space and a place where she could prepare the herbs, tinctures, and remedies that supplemented her midwifery practice. Women came to her not just for birthing assistance, but for treatments of various female complaints, for advice on preventing or encouraging conception, for help with problems that they could not or would not discuss with their husbands or male community members. She maintained an extensive garden of medicinal plants, many of which she had brought with her from Tennessee, or acquired through trade with other practitioners and with the few remaining indigenous people who occasionally passed through the region. Her knowledge of herbs was encyclopedic, encompassing not just their effects, but the precise timing of harvest, methods of preparation, and combinations that enhanced or modified their properties. She kept detailed records in a series of journals written in her clear, precise handwriting, documenting every birth she attended, every treatment she provided, and observations about patterns she noticed across her years of practice. It was this record-keeping that would eventually reveal the pattern that made Judith Mercer's story transition from frontier medical practice into something far stranger and more disturbing. But in 1849, as our narrative properly begins, she was simply known as an excellent midwife, perhaps a bit stern and uncompromising, but reliable and skilled. When a woman went into labor anywhere within a day's travel of Birch Creek, someone was sent to fetch Judith, and she came always, regardless of weather or personal inconvenience. She charged modest fees when families could pay and accepted goods or labor when they could not, and she never refused a call. Until she did. The first refusal occurred in late March of 1849, when a young woman named Sarah Mitchell went into labor with her first child. Sarah was 19 years old, married less than a year to Thomas Mitchell, a farmer who worked a small plot several miles from Birch Creek. The labor began in the evening, and Thomas immediately set out to fetch Judith, making the journey in darkness by lantern light, arriving at her cabin sometime after midnight. He found her awake, as if she had been expecting him, sitting by her fire with a book open on her lap. When he explained that Sarah was in labor, that the pains had been coming regularly for several hours and were growing stronger, Judith asked a single question. "What phase is the moon?" Thomas, confused by the question and anxious about his wife, stammered that he didn't know, that he hadn't paid attention to such things. Judith stood, walked to her door, opened it, and looked up at the night sky. Thomas followed her gaze and saw that the moon was new, invisible, or perhaps just a sliver so thin it could barely be distinguished from darkness. Judith closed the door, returned to her chair, and said simply, "I will not attend this birth." Thomas was stunned. He repeated his request, explaining that Sarah was in difficulty, that she was frightened, that she needed help. Judith's response was unwavering. She would not attend a birth during the new moon phase. She offered no explanation for this refusal, no justification or apology. She simply stated it as fact, as immutable as the seasons or the movement of celestial bodies. Thomas grew angry, as was understandable for a young man whose wife was in potentially mortal danger, and who was being refused help for no reason he could comprehend. He argued, pleaded, eventually threatened. Judith listened to all of it with apparent calm, and when he had exhausted himself, she repeated her position. She would not attend. She could provide him with certain herbs that might ease Sarah's labor, and she could give him instructions on what to do if complications arose. But she herself would not come to the Mitchell home during the new moon. Thomas left with the herbs and instructions, furious and frightened in equal measure. He returned home to find that Sarah's labor had progressed rapidly in his absence, and with the assistance of 2 neighbor women who had been summoned, she delivered a healthy son just before dawn. The birth was uncomplicated, requiring none of the interventions that Judith would have provided had she been present. Mother and child both survived without difficulty. The story of Judith's refusal spread quickly through the community, generating considerable discussion and speculation. Some people defended her, suggesting that perhaps she had been ill or had other obligations that prevented her from attending. Others were troubled, pointing out that a midwife who refused calls was violating the fundamental expectation of her role, that the entire community's well-being depended on practitioners of essential skills being available when needed. Judith offered no public explanation or defense. When confronted by a delegation of concerned community members, she simply stated that she would not attend births during the new moon, that this was her position, and it would not change, and that families were free to make whatever alternative arrangements they deemed appropriate. She seemed entirely unconcerned about the possibility of losing the respect or trust of the community, entirely confident that her decision was correct even if others could not understand it. The second refusal came in May, and it followed the same pattern. A woman went into labor during the new moon phase. A messenger was sent to fetch Judith, and she refused to attend. This second refusal was more problematic than the first, because the laboring woman was experiencing complications, a presentation that appeared abnormal, bleeding that seemed excessive. Without Judith's skilled intervention, the situation deteriorated, and both mother and infant died before dawn. The community was outraged. 2 deaths that might have been prevented if Judith had simply done her duty, fulfilled her obligation, provided the service that defined her role in the settlement. A larger delegation confronted her, this time with demands rather than requests, insisting that she explain her refusal and either commit to attending all births, regardless of lunar phase, or surrender her role as the community's midwife to someone who would serve without arbitrary restrictions. Judith's response surprised them. She agreed that she should explain, that they deserved understanding of her position, even if they ultimately disagreed with it. She invited the delegation, 5 women and 3 men, who represented the informal leadership of Birch Creek, into her cabin, where she opened one of her journals and began to show them what she had documented over her 30 years of practice. What Judith revealed was a pattern she had noticed gradually, over many years, a correlation that had become undeniable through careful record-keeping and observation. Children born during the new moon phase, she explained, were different. Not immediately, not in ways that were obvious at birth or even in early childhood, but as they matured, they displayed characteristics and behaviors that set them apart from children born during other lunar phases. The delegation was skeptical, as would be expected. The idea that the moon's phase at birth could affect a child's nature was the sort of superstition that educated people dismissed, the kind of folk belief that had no basis in medical or scientific understanding. But Judith was persistent, and she had data. She showed them entries in her journals documenting births she had attended across 3 decades, noting not just the medical details of each delivery, but also the lunar phase and, in many cases, follow-up observations about the children as they grew. According to her records, children born during the new moon phase, defined as the 3 days when the moon was essentially invisible or barely a sliver in the sky, showed a significantly higher incidence of what she termed peculiarities. These peculiarities varied widely, but shared a quality of fundamental wrongness that was difficult to articulate, but unmistakable to those who encountered it. Some of the children were described as strangely intelligent, precociously articulate, possessing knowledge they should not have. Others were the opposite, developmentally delayed in ways that went beyond normal variation, remaining childlike even as they aged into adolescence and adulthood. Many of the new moon children, Judith claimed, showed behavioral abnormalities, cruelty that exceeded normal childhood aggression, manipulation of others that seemed calculated rather than instinctive, or complete absence of normal emotional responses to situations that should provoke fear, joy, or sadness. Some were described as having strange effects on animals, causing horses to bolt or dogs to cower without apparent cause. A few had died young under circumstances that Judith's entries described vaguely as troubling or unnatural, without providing specific details. The delegation listened to this presentation with a mixture of fascination and doubt. Even if Judith's observations were accurate, and many questioned whether her record-keeping was sufficiently objective to trust. The connection to lunar phase seemed like correlation mistaken for causation, the human tendency to find patterns even in random variation. Hundreds of children had been born in the region over the decades, and even if a percentage showed developmental or behavioral problems, that was to be expected. Linking it to the timing of their birth relative to the moon was no different from blaming illness on bad air or attributing disasters to divine displeasure. Judith anticipated their skepticism and pressed further. She pointed to specific cases, children who had grown into adults and whose peculiarities were known to the community, even if their connection to new moon births was not. She named names, people present in the delegation's memory, whose oddities had been noticed but attributed to individual variation or family traits rather than to the circumstances of their birth. One man she mentioned was David Carver, born during the new moon in February of 1822, who had grown into an adult known for his complete inability to feel pain. This was documented through multiple incidents: burns, cuts, even a broken bone that he had walked on for days without seeking treatment because he simply did not experience the injury as painful. Another example was Margaret Ellis, born in November of 1831 during a new moon, who had demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict deaths, announcing with certainty that specific individuals would die within days, and being proven correct with disturbing frequency. These cases, and others Judith cited, gave the delegation pause. The people she mentioned were known to them, their peculiarities real and documented. The fact that they had all been born during new moon phases was something that could be verified through family records and community memory. The correlation was striking enough to make dismissal more difficult than it initially seemed. But even granting that the correlation might be real, the delegation argued, it did not justify refusing to attend new moon births. If anything, it suggested that such births required more skilled attention, not less, that children who might face unusual challenges deserved the best possible start that a competent midwife could provide. Judith's refusal seemed like abandonment of precisely those infants who most needed her help. Judith's counter-argument was complex and disturbing. She believed, based on her observations, that the peculiarities exhibited by new moon children were not the result of birth complications or medical factors that a skilled midwife could prevent. Rather, they were inherent to the timing of the birth itself, as if something about the new moon phase, whether through physical forces that affected fetal development or through more mysterious mechanisms, created children who were fundamentally different from those born under other lunar phases. More troubling, she suggested that her very skill as a midwife might exacerbate the problem. A difficult birth that resulted in early death might be nature's way of preventing a problematic individual from entering the community. By saving new moon infants who would otherwise die, she might be introducing individuals whose presence would ultimately harm the community more than their deaths would have. It was a utilitarian calculation, cold and disturbing, but one that Judith articulated with complete conviction. The delegation recoiled from this reasoning, recognizing it as a justification for selective infanticide, for allowing children to die based on superstitious beliefs about their birth timing. Several members left Judith's cabin immediately, unwilling to continue a conversation that had taken such a dark turn. The remaining members tried to reason with her, pointing out the ethical enormity of what she was suggesting, the impossibility of justifying the death of innocents based on speculative patterns that might be entirely coincidental. Judith listened without apparent emotion, and when they finished, she simply stated her position once more. She would not attend new moon births. If the community wished to replace her with another midwife, she would not oppose that decision, but she would not change her own practice. She had spent 30 years learning her craft, had delivered hundreds of infants, had seen patterns that others might miss, and she had reached a conclusion that she would not abandon even under pressure from the community she served. The delegation left without reaching any resolution, and the community found itself divided over how to respond. Some argued for forcing Judith to either attend all births or surrender her position entirely. Others defended her right to practice according to her own judgment, noting that even if her reasoning was questionable, her refusal to attend specific births did not prevent other people from providing assistance during those times. A few, more thoughtful or troubled, began reviewing their own community's history, looking for evidence that might confirm or refute Judith's claims about new moon children. What they found was disturbing enough to shift the nature of the debate. While not everyone agreed on the interpretation, there was substantial evidence that individuals born during new moon phases did show a higher incidence of unusual characteristics and behaviors. Family records, church registries, and community memory could establish birth dates for many individuals, and when those dates were correlated with lunar phases and then compared to life outcomes, the pattern Judith had identified appeared to have some statistical validity. This discovery did not resolve the ethical question. Even if new moon children were more likely to develop problems, that did not justify abandoning them to die at birth. But it did make Judith's position more complicated, transforming her from a superstitious woman refusing to do her duty into someone who had identified a genuine pattern and was responding to it according to her own moral calculus, however disturbing that calculus might be. Through the summer of 1849, the community continued to grapple with the situation. 3 more births occurred during new moon phases. In each case, Judith refused to attend, and in each case, other women provided assistance as best they could. 2 of the births resulted in healthy children who, as infants, showed no obvious abnormalities. The 3rd resulted in a stillbirth, though whether Judith's absence contributed to that outcome was impossible to determine. It was during this period that a young woman named Elizabeth Harper, pregnant with her first child and approaching her due date, consulted an almanac and realized with growing horror that her expected delivery date fell during the next new moon phase, scheduled for early September. Elizabeth was intelligent and well-read by frontier standards, the daughter of a school teacher who had instilled in her both literacy and a skeptical attitude towards superstition. She did not believe in Judith's theories about new moon children, but she was frightened by the prospect of giving birth without the most skilled midwife in the region attending. Elizabeth went to Judith privately, attempting to reason with her, to persuade her to make an exception for this one birth. She argued that the entire theory was unproven, that correlation was not causation, that individual children should not be prejudged based on the accident of their birth timing. Judith listened patiently and then asked Elizabeth a question. If there was even a possibility that the theory was correct, if there was a chance that her child might be born with inherent tendencies toward cruelty, manipulation, or other harmful behaviors, would she want that child to receive the best possible medical care to ensure its survival? The question was ingeniously cruel, forcing Elizabeth to confront the logical extension of Judith's position. If the theory was correct, then ensuring a new moonchild's survival might not be the moral choice it appeared to be. If given the option between a difficult birth that resulted in an infant death and a successful birth that produced a child who would grow up to harm others, which would a moral person choose? Elizabeth refused to engage with the hypothetical, insisting that it was based on unfounded assumptions and that the only moral choice was to provide medical care to every infant, regardless of speculation about future behavior. But she left Judith's cabin troubled, the question planted in her mind like a seed that would grow whether she wanted it to or not. As Elizabeth's due date approached, she made preparations with increasing anxiety. She arranged for several other women to attend her birth, including one who had some training from Judith years earlier, and who was considered the second most competent midwife in the area. She gathered supplies, prepared her home, and tried to maintain confidence that everything would proceed normally, even without Judith's attendance. But privately, she found herself wondering about Judith's claims. She reviewed what was known about individuals born during new moon phases, and while she remained skeptical of any causal connection, she could not entirely dismiss the patterns, and she found herself, against her own rational judgment, beginning to notice things about those individuals that seemed to confirm Judith's theories. A coldness in their eyes, a manipulative quality in their interactions, a sense that something fundamental was missing from their humanity. Elizabeth recognized this as confirmation bias, the human tendency to notice evidence that supports existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory information. But recognition did not dispel the growing anxiety. As the new moon approached and her labor began on schedule, she was consumed by fears that went beyond normal birthing anxiety. What if Judith was right? What if there was something about the lunar phase that affected fetal development in ways that produced genuinely harmful individuals? What if she was about to bring into the world a child who would cause suffering to others, a child who would have been better unborn? The labor was long and difficult. Elizabeth's contracting began in the early morning and continued through the day and into the evening, without significant progress. The attending women grew increasingly concerned as the hours stretched on, recognizing that the presentation might be abnormal, that intervention might be necessary beyond their limited skills. Multiple times they suggested sending for Judith despite her stated refusal, arguing that the emergency nature of the situation might persuade her to reconsider. But Elizabeth, in the midst of her pain and fear, made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She refused to send for Judith. If the midwife believed that new moon children should be allowed to die rather than be saved, if there was even a possibility that Judith's theories had some validity, then perhaps it was better not to fight too hard for this infant's survival. If nature decreed that the child should not live, perhaps she should accept that decree rather than demand intervention that might produce a worse outcome. The logic was tortured, shaped by exhaustion and pain and fear, and Elizabeth herself was not entirely sure she believed it. But she clung to it through the long night, refusing Judith's assistance even as her own situation deteriorated. And finally, near dawn, after more than 20 hours of labor, she delivered a son who never drew breath, who was born already dead, having died from complications that Judith's skilled hands might well have prevented. The death devastated Elizabeth, and in the weeks and months that followed, she was consumed by guilt and uncertainty about her decision. Had she killed her own child through passive refusal of available help? Or had she allowed nature to take its course in a situation where survival might have produced something worse than death? The questions were unanswerable, and they drove her into a depression that never fully lifted. a grief complicated by the impossible nature of the choice she had been forced to confront. The community's reaction to Elizabeth's experience was complex and divided. Some blamed Judith entirely, arguing that her refusal to attend had created the situation that led to the infant's death, that her theories had poisoned Elizabeth's mind at the most vulnerable moment. Others suggested that Elizabeth's own decision not to send for Judith was the critical factor, that Judith had not been given the opportunity to attend, even if she might have reconsidered in a genuine emergency. Judith herself remained unmoved and seemingly unconcerned about the community's judgment of her actions. When confronted about Elizabeth's loss, she simply stated that tragic outcomes occurred in childbirth, regardless of who attended, that the infant might have died even with her assistance, and that Elizabeth had made her own choice about whether to seek help. She expressed no guilt, no regret, and no willingness to reconsider her position on new moon births. But something had shifted in the community's relationship with Judith. The abstract debate about her theories had become concrete through Elizabeth's tragedy, and many people who had previously defended Judith's right to practice according to her own judgment now found her position untenable. A second, larger delegation approached her in late autumn, this time with an ultimatum. She must either agree to attend all births, regardless of lunar phase, or she would no longer be recognized as the community's midwife, and other arrangements would be made to ensure that birthing women had access to competent care. Judith's response was characteristically uncompromising. She would not change her position, but she also would not prevent others from seeking alternative practitioners or training additional midwives. If the community wanted to replace her, that was their prerogative. But she would continue her practice according to the standards she had established, serving those who sought her help during acceptable lunar phases and declining cases that fell outside those parameters. This response created a practical problem, because there was no obvious replacement for Judith. The woman with secondary training was competent for normal births, but lacked the experience and skill to handle complications. Training a new midwife would take years, during which the community would remain dependent on Judith for difficult cases. The situation was unsustainable. A midwife who refused a significant percentage of births, but whose absence during those births created genuine risk of maternal and infant mortality. The winter of 1849-1850 brought the situation to a crisis point. Multiple births occurred during new moon phases, and in each case, Judith refused to attend. The outcomes varied, some successful, some tragic, but the pattern was clear. Women giving birth during roughly 1/4 of the lunar cycle were denied access to the most skilled medical practitioner in the region, and some of them and their infants were dying as a result. In February of 1850, a woman named Martha Grayson went into labor during a new moon phase while already weakened by illness. Her case was complicated by the fact that this was her 6th child, and previous births had been increasingly difficult. Without Judith's attendance, the labor proceeded disastrously, and Martha died of hemorrhage before help could reach her from more distant settlements. The infant survived, delivered by desperate women who had no training beyond what they had learned from their own birthing experiences. Martha's death galvanized the community. She had been well loved, a pillar of the settlement, mother to 5 children who were now left without her. Her death was preventable, everyone agreed. If Judith had attended, she would likely have survived. The fact that she had died because of a midwife's refusal, based on superstitious theories about lunar influence, was intolerable. A crowd gathered at Judith's cabin the day after Martha's death, and the mood was ugly in a way that previous confrontations had not been. People were not interested in discussion or debate. They wanted Judith gone, expelled from the community, her practice ended permanently. Some voices called for more extreme action, suggesting that she should face justice for the deaths her refusals had caused, that she was guilty of something approaching murder through negligent abandonment. Judith faced the crowd from her doorway, and for the first time, observers noticed something in her expression that might have been fear, or perhaps resignation. She listened to the accusations and demands, and then she made an offer that surprised everyone. She would leave. She would pack her belongings, abandon her cabin and her practice, and remove herself from the community that no longer wanted her services. But before she left, she wanted to show them something, to provide evidence that might help them understand why she had taken the position that had cost her everything. The crowd's mood shifted slightly, curiosity mixing with anger. Judith invited representatives into her cabin, as many as could fit, and she opened her journals to specific entries, cases from her early years of practice that she had not previously shared with the community. What she showed them was more disturbing than anything they had anticipated. The entries documented several children born during new moon phases in the 1820s and 1830s, infants Judith had successfully delivered who had survived and grown into adults. She had tracked these individuals informally over the years, noting their development and behaviors. According to her records, multiple members of this cohort had been responsible for serious harms: violence, theft, manipulation that destroyed families, cruelty that went beyond normal human vice into something that seemed pathological. Most disturbingly, she documented 3 cases of individuals born during new moon phases who had committed murders. These were not crimes of passion or accidents escalating beyond intent, but calculated killings that suggested a complete absence of normal human empathy or moral restraint. In each case, the murderer had shown signs from childhood of the peculiarities Judith associated with new moon births: emotional coldness, manipulation of others, cruelty to animals, and precocious intelligence combined with apparent lack of conscience. The crowd did not know how to process this information. The cases Judith cited were real. The crimes had occurred. The individuals she named had indeed been executed or imprisoned for the acts she described. The claim that they had all been born during new moon phases could be verified through family records, and when checked later, it would be confirmed as accurate in each case. But even granting that the correlation was real, the ethical calculation remained impossible. How many normal, healthy children would have to be denied medical care and allowed to die to prevent one future murderer from being born? How could anyone make that determination? Weigh lives not yet lived against potential harms not yet committed. The very premise seemed monstrous, an echo of the darkest utilitarian calculus. Judith did not argue that her position was comfortable or easy to defend. She simply stated that she had seen the pattern, understood its implications, and made a choice about how to respond. She had saved hundreds of lives over her 3 decades of practice, but she had also, through her skill, ensured the survival of individuals who had gone on to cause tremendous suffering. She could not undo those past decisions, but she could refuse to repeat them. She would not use her abilities to bring into the world children born under lunar conditions that her experience had taught her produced individuals fundamentally different from normal humanity. The crowd dispersed without reaching a clear resolution, but Judith's offer to leave stood. She packed her belongings over the following days, preparing to depart the community that had been her home for 15 years. As word spread of her impending departure, something unexpected occurred. Several families privately approached her, thanking her for her service and expressing understanding, if not agreement, with her position. Some admitted that they had noticed patterns similar to what she described, had seen behaviors in new moon children that troubled them. had wondered whether there might be something to the folk beliefs about lunar influence on human nature. These private conversations revealed that Judith's theories were not as isolated or bizarre as the public debate had made them appear. Many people in the community held superstitious beliefs about the moon's influence on various aspects of life: planting times, human behavior during full moons, propitious and unpropitious days for various activities. The idea that birth timing might matter was not particularly strange within that worldview, even if the specific claim about new moon children seemed extreme. Judith left Birch Creek in mid-March of 1850, taking with her only what she could carry in a wagon, leaving her cabin and most of her possessions behind. She traveled south, eventually settling in a different region of Arkansas, where her history was unknown. According to records that can be traced with reasonable confidence, she continued practicing midwifery in her new location, and there too she maintained her refusal to attend new moon births. The community she joined apparently accepted this restriction, either because they shared her beliefs or because her skill during other lunar phases was valuable enough to tolerate her peculiar limitation. Back in Birch Creek, the community struggled to fill the gap left by Judith's departure. The woman with secondary training took on the primary midwife role, and two younger women began apprenticing to develop the skills that would eventually make them competent practitioners. The transition was difficult, and several births during the following year resulted in complications that Judith's experience might have prevented. Interestingly, the new midwives did not adopt Judith's restriction on new moon births. They attended all births regardless of lunar phase, approaching each case with the medical care that Judith had refused to provide for roughly a quarter of the calendar. Over the subsequent years, multiple children were born during new moon phases in Birch Creek, and their development was watched with particular attention by many community members who were aware of Judith's theories. The results were ambiguous. The way some of the new moon children developed into normal, healthy adults who showed no particular oddities or troubling behaviors. Others did display characteristics that seemed to confirm Judith's theories: unusual intelligence or significant developmental delays, emotional coldness or manipulative tendencies, problems that could be noticed even if their connection to birth timing remained speculative. One case was particularly troubling and would be remembered for decades. A boy born during the new moon in April of 1851, delivered by the new primary midwife with no complications, developed into a child who displayed what modern psychology would recognize as psychopathic characteristics: superficial charm, complete lack of empathy, manipulative behavior that intensified as he aged, and a progression toward violence that culminated in his killing of a neighbor's dog at age 12 in a manner that suggested deliberate cruelty rather than childish accident. The boy's parents sought help from various sources, including the church and what limited medical expertise was available, but nothing seemed to address the fundamental wrongness of his nature. By age 16, he had been involved in several incidents of theft and assault, and he was eventually sent away to live with relatives in another state, where records become difficult to trace but suggest a life characterized by continued antisocial behavior and likely criminal activity. When this case became known, it inevitably generated renewed discussion of Judith's theories. Had she been right to refuse to attend new moon births? Would it have been better if this particular child had not survived his delivery? The questions were as unanswerable as ever, but they carried more weight now that the community had direct experience with a child whose birth timing correlated with exactly the kind of pathological behavior Judith had predicted. News of Judith's whereabouts occasionally filtered back to Birch Creek through traders and travelers. She continued her practice in her new community, apparently with similar policies about new moon births. In the mid-1850s, reports suggested that she had trained an apprentice who shared her views on lunar influence, ensuring that her approach would continue even after her own death. She lived until 1867, dying at age 65 from an illness that her own medical knowledge could not cure, and she was apparently practicing midwifery until the final weeks of her life. Her journals, the detailed records that had formed the basis for her theories about new moon children, were inherited by her apprentice, and eventually passed down through several generations of midwives who maintained an interest in the patterns she had identified. Portions of these journals have survived in historical archives, and they provide remarkable documentation of frontier medical practice, as well as the statistical data underlying Judith's controversial theories. Modern researchers examining these records have found them both fascinating and problematic. The documentation is meticulous, with clear notations of lunar phases, birth outcomes, and follow-up observations about child development. But the follow-up observations are necessarily subjective and potentially biased. Judith knew which children she was observing, knew their birth timing, and may have been unconsciously looking for evidence that confirmed her theories while overlooking or minimizing contradictory information. Statistical analysis of her data shows that there is indeed a correlation between new moon births and higher incidence of developmental and behavioral problems. But the effect size is modest, and the absolute numbers are small enough that the pattern could plausibly be attributed to chance rather than causation. Modern science has found no plausible mechanism by which lunar phase at birth could affect neurological or psychological development, and controlled studies in contemporary populations have generally found no significant correlations between birth timing and behavioral outcomes. Yet some researchers have noted that the absence of a known mechanism does not necessarily invalidate an observed correlation, and that pre-modern medical practitioners often identified real patterns without understanding their causes. Aspirin relieved pain for decades before anyone understood why. Scurvy could be prevented by citrus consumption long before vitamin C was discovered. Perhaps Judith was observing a genuine phenomenon, even if she misattributed it to lunar influence. Alternative explanations have been proposed. Some researchers suggest that lunar phase might correlate with other factors that do affect fetal development: seasonal variation in nutrition, environmental stressors, disease exposure, or maternal stress levels that vary with seasonal agricultural cycles. If new moon periods happened to coincide with times of year when pregnant women in frontier communities faced particular hardships, that could produce the observed correlation without requiring any direct lunar influence on the developing fetus. Others have noted that Judith's period of practice coincided with particularly difficult times for Ozark settlements: economic hardship, disease outbreaks, social disruption following the Civil War. Children born during periods of high maternal stress might indeed show higher rates of developmental problems, and if those stressful periods correlated with certain lunar phases through chance or through the scheduling of community activities around the lunar cycle, the pattern Judith observed might reflect real effects of maternal stress rather than lunar influence per se. The ethical questions raised by Judith's case remain profoundly difficult. Even if her observations were accurate and new moon children did show higher rates of troubling behaviors, would that justify denying them medical care? Could anyone morally make the decision to allow an infant to die based on statistical probabilities about their future behavior? And if such decisions were morally permissible, who would have the authority and responsibility to make them? These questions extend far beyond Judith's specific case into broader issues of medical ethics, prenatal screening, and the moral status of potential versus actual persons. Modern medical technology allows us to detect many conditions before birth. raising questions about selective abortion, genetic intervention, and the criteria by which we decide which lives are worth bringing into the world. Judith's case provides a historical example of how these dilemmas have always existed, even in much simpler technological contexts. The community of Birch Creek continued to grapple with the legacy of Judith's theories for generations. Some families maintained the belief that new moon births were unlucky or produced problematic children, and they took steps to avoid conception that would result in delivery during those phases. Other families rejected such superstitions as backwards thinking, incompatible with modern understanding. The debate never fully resolved, becoming instead one of those persistent disagreements that characterizes any community where people hold different views about the relationship between natural patterns and human fate. The practice of midwifery continued to evolve, of course, and by the late 19th century, trained physicians were beginning to attend births even in remote areas, bringing medical knowledge and techniques that far exceeded what traditional midwives could provide. As formal medicine displaced folk practice, the specific questions about lunar influence faded in importance, replaced by scientific understanding of fetal development and birth complications that made such correlations seem irrelevant. But in the historical record, Judith Mercer remains a disturbing figure, a competent medical practitioner who developed theories that led her to refuse care to a specific subset of patients, a woman whose observations may have identified a genuine pattern even if her interpretation of that pattern was incorrect, a person whose ethical calculus placed community protection above individual infant survival in a way that modern medical ethics would find absolutely unacceptable. Her story raises questions about the responsibilities of medical practitioners, the boundaries between observation and superstition, the tension between individual patient care and broader community concerns, and the enormous difficulty of making moral decisions in situations where all available choices seem to involve accepting some form of harm. These are not questions that admit of simple answers, and Judith's legacy remains ethically complicated in ways that resist any easy judgment of her actions as clearly right or clearly wrong. The hollow where Judith lived for 15 years before her exile still exists, the foundations of her cabin barely visible beneath decades of forest regrowth. The communities she served have evolved beyond recognition, connected now by roads and technologies that have erased the isolation that once defined frontier existence. The births she attended are remembered only in archived records and family histories. The infants she delivered now long dead, their lives completed, and their behaviors no longer subject to debate about causation or correlation. But the pattern she claimed to observe, the troubling behaviors of new moon children, the correlation between birth timing and developmental outcomes, remains provocative for anyone who examines the historical record with openness to the possibility that she was observing something real, even if her explanation was wrong. Perhaps there was a mechanism, now lost or no longer operative, that created the pattern she documented. Perhaps the pattern was always illusory, confirmation bias given false credibility through selective record-keeping. Or perhaps some mysteries persist precisely because they exist at the boundaries of what we can reliably observe and what we can definitively explain. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark's most ethically troubling stories, a tale of a midwife whose observations led her to conclusions that challenged the fundamental duty of medical care, whose refusals cost lives while claiming to prevent greater harms, whose legacy remains disputed and disturbing more than a century after her death. Judith Mercer stands as a reminder that the relationship between observation and understanding is never simple, that patterns can be real even when explanations are wrong, and that the hardest moral choices are those where every option involves accepting that someone will be harmed by our decision. If you've made it this far on this journey through the ambiguous territory between medical practice and moral philosophy, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between folk wisdom and superstition, between protective caution and harmful prejudice. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on whether practitioners should ever refuse care based on patterns they observe, even when those patterns lack scientific explanation. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you uncomfortable in productive ways that resist easy resolution, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate complexity that doesn't dissolve into simple answers. Until our next journey into territories where right and wrong blur together in ways that demand we think carefully about our certainties. Drive safely, and remember that the most difficult ethical questions are often those where well-meaning people can disagree profoundly, while each maintaining genuine conviction that their position serves justice and prevents harm.